Great. So I'll be talking about Bureaucrats and the Korean export miracle, joint work with Jay Lee. And yeah, let me dive in. So a big motivation, as a few people mentioned today, is that industrial policy is back, where we have in economics a few studies that look at the economic mechanisms behind successful or less successful industrial policy, or to how to optimally design industrial policies. What we often don't consider, or what we don't have good evidence of, is if countries have the capacity to implement a given industrial policy. So here I am asking, does industrial policy's effect depend on the capacity with which it is implemented? And yeah, so in doing that, the literature that I'm most closely relating to is the one on bureaucratic capacity and economic development. And here the questions are, does this bureaucratic capacity matter for industrial policies, for more economic policies, and also in the particular case of a growth miracle? So the growth miracle I'll be talking about is South Korea, which in 1960 was poorer than most of sub-Saharan Africa, and today it has about the same per capita income as France, while economic growth was going up a lot across the board. Exports grew particularly fast. So here you can see South Korean exports per capita relative to US exports per capita, which was at about 1/100th in the late 1950s. And then it grew to reach parity in the 1990s with the US. And looking at some other countries, you can see there's nothing kind of mechanical about this occurring during this time period. So while all this is going on the left-hand side, so to speak, the government was doing a bunch of industrial and export promotion policies. And what I'm doing here is I'm not going to focus on the particular effect of any one of these policies. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm zooming in on one policy and studying how much the people behind that policy matter. And in doing so, I'm linking economic effects to individuals. So how much does this policy's effect depend on individual bureaucrats? And so I'm building on research by Kramatz and Margolis, Bertrand and Shoa, who studied the role of individual managers in the performance of organization, or sparked that literature. And that's really what I'm looking at as well, just that my bureaucrats or my managers are intent on implementing an industrial policy. So this is the roadmap for the talk. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the setting that allows me to identify how implementing capacity changes a policy's effect. Then there are three results. I'm going to spend almost all my time on the large differences in exports that I find due to individual bureaucrats. And I'll very briefly give you the one-slide version of the other two results. And so when you are thinking about how implementing capacity changes a policy's effect, to quantify that, you need to face a couple of central challenges. The first one is that you need variation in implementing capacity while holding fixed the policy that you're studying. So you may want the same policy implemented in many different locations. But then, of course, locations differ by many characteristics, among other things, economic conditions. So a second thing that you want is you want variation in implementing capacity while also holding fixed the location in which the policy is being implemented. And a natural source of this type of variation occurs when you have individual bureaucrats centrally responsible for this policy in each location, and these guys move over time. And yeah, so you need enough of those bureaucrats to move, and you need ideally also one-to-one mapping of bureaucrats to the main outcome targeted by this policy. And if you're even more ambitious, then you want this outcome to be closely linked to economic growth. So the setting that I believe satisfies these conditions is overseas export promotion by the Korea Trade Promotion Agency. So let me first show you the many locations in which this policy is being implemented. So here you can see the rollout of this policy, which mainly happened during the 1960s and 1970s. And essentially, once a country lights up, for almost all of these countries, it remains. The policy continues to be implemented in all of these countries until the end of this time period that I've shown you here. Now, each of these offices has the same single goal, and that is to increase Korean exports to the particular country where the office is located. They also pursue this via three buckets of activities that are also roughly the same across those different countries and over time. So one is to write reports on market demand. So the essence of one report could be, right now is a good time to sell batteries to the United States. The essence of another type of report could be, if you want to sell dress shirts to the United States, you should fold them in a different way to make them look bigger, because that's what the customer wants. The second part of this is to find new trade partners, so to reach out to potential importers in the US, for example, to a car manufacturer and say, you've been importing batteries from Japan over the last 15 years, so wouldn't you like to try importing those from South Korea as well? And then these are being reported to potential Korean exporters. The last one is to facilitate that Korean firms attend international trade fairs. And those three activities essentially exist between 1965 and 2001. So while you have this policy being implemented in many different countries and many different locations over time, in each location you have variation in terms of who is responsible for this. So here you see the newspaper clippings that announce that Manager B1 is appointed to head the London office in 1981, Manager B2 is appointed to head the London office in 1984, Manager B3 is appointed to head the London office in 1987. These guys stay with the organization for a long period of time, so these managers, these particular ones, are also observed in other locations managing those specific offices, and you can see that even those three bureaucrats, throughout their career, they already connect 8 of the countries in the data that I'm looking at, and that's important for statistical power then. So to preview the results, the main one is that one standard deviation increase in manager ability increases exports by 37%. And this uses variation from the rotation of these bureaucrats tasked with exports to each country. And the key assumption here is that the appointments of these bureaucrats are quasi-random with respect to underlying export trends. The second result is the policy's average effect. So you can think about this as variation around this average effect. And the average effect happens to be around 38%, which uses the staggered rollout of these offices to countries over time. And then the key assumption here is that these office openings don't target growing markets. The last result that I usually have least time to talk about is, which is why I'm preempting it, is that bureaucrat experience shapes what products benefit from this policy. So if you use import demand shocks in a bureaucrat's first appointment, let's say during your first appointment you are exposed to an import demand shock in batteries rather than cars. The country that you're appointed to happens to start importing a lot more batteries from other countries. You might be working more on batteries because of that. And what I find is that, well, this raises Korean exports of batteries in your next appointment. And the interpretation of that is that capacity of this organization, of the state, of the bureaucracy, grows endogenously depending on what those bureaucrats are working on. This is a pretty positive story, potentially, but another way of referring to endogenous capacity growth is to call it path dependence. Because if those bureaucrats are working on something that was very promising, say, in the 1960s, that may not be very promising or very important to the Korean state, to the Korean economy in the 1970s or 80s. I also want to briefly talk about the effect size. So the important takeaway that I would really like you to remember is that this policy looks like it is ineffective if it is implemented by bureaucrats that are one standard deviation below average, despite having a pretty large average effect. So kind of the capacity with which it's implemented, in this case the specific bureaucrat, really seems to matter. I also want to mention these effects are pretty large, but you should definitely see them in the context of South Korean export growth over this time period. So we saw this 50-fold increase in exports per capita relative to the US. You can also look at annual export growth, which is just massive. So please take that into account when you think about these effect sizes. Another way of quantifying the effect size is not to look at this 37% increase, but the more common AKM classification, where we look at how much do individuals matter versus organizations. So in this case, bureaucrats versus countries. These bureaucrats explain only about 1/7 of this variation, which is a bit less than in some other studies of both how much managers matter, both in the public sector and in the private sector. But of course, the outcome is a bit more distant from the typical manager. So let me talk about these differences between bureaucrats. So these are identified from an AKM model. So we're explaining some outcome variable using a fixed effect for bureaucrat B, who is appointed, who is managing the office in country C in year T. Then you have a country fixed effect, gamma C, and you have a product year fixed effect, which essentially takes out all the variation that is common to Korean exports across all countries in 1979. So for example, any kind of policies that you can think of that the Korean government is pursuing that don't differ by destination country, they could potentially be soaked up by this type of fixed effect. Yeah, and then two important things about when these bureaucrat fixed effects can be identified is that, first of all, the bureaucrat and country effects are only identified within the largest set of countries and bureaucrats. You couldn't make any comparison between bureaucrats that don't have any link between them by other bureaucrat moves, basically. And then the key assumption is that the ability of the bureaucrat that is in country C in year T is orthogonal to the error term up here, which you could call trends in underlying exports. This allows for a pretty rich pattern of sorting. There are a number of David Card papers that discuss this at great length. For example, it allows for better bureaucrats being sent to countries with higher fixed effects. That wouldn't be violating these identifying assumptions. And yeah, just to be clear regarding the export data, the sample here contains all country years that have a bureaucrat managing them between 1965 and 2000. There are no gaps in this panel. And yeah, so export are measured at the 4-digit product level using the World Trade Flows database that has been mentioned by another paper today. And then I'm using an inverse hyperbolic sine transformation, also as another paper has done. I'm doing some robustness around that. Basically, it doesn't matter so much which transformation you're using there. You just want to account for the zeros because there are zeros in the data. It doesn't matter so much in the sense of do bureaucrats matter. Of course, it matters for the, yeah, if you have a different outcome, you have a different effect. So then the next thing that you could do is you can run this regression and just plot the raw fixed effects that you get out of it. And then you could be comparing a bureaucrat that's at the 25th percentile, and you can compare those to a bureaucrat that's at the 50th percentile, and you could jump to the conclusion that increasing a bureaucrat's ability from the 25th to the 50th percentile gives you whatever the difference between those two is on the y-axis in terms of additional exports. Now, if I was just doing that, you should have a couple of concerns. The first one is I haven't shown you anything that this identifying assumption is true. I'm going to do that on the next slide. And the second one is that the bureaucrat fixed effects are estimated with error. They may be unbiased if these are indeed orthogonal, but they would be estimated with error. And then when you take the variance of that, so quadratic form, you're going to overstate how important those bureaucrats are. This bias is pretty well understood. It's inversely related to the connectivity of the country bureaucrat graph. And the solution that we are going to follow is by Patrick Klein and co-authors, which requires estimating the bias that you would get from using just the variance of the estimated bureaucrat abilities. If you were just using that to get an estimate of the variation in bureaucrat ability. So one important restriction on the Klein et al. Approach is that it requires you to have a leave one out connected set of countries and bureaucrats. That's a stricter requirement than just a connected set, which is what you would need to just get an estimate of all those bureaucrat fixed effects. And what's pretty nice is because you're observing 35 years of these offices operating, and many of these offices are in fact open for 20 plus years, right? You saw that in 1981, most of these offices were open. So in 20 plus years, the average office gets about 7 different bureaucrats, right? So you get a lot of movers there, and the leave one out connected set actually contains 75 out of those 87 countries, or 93% of those appointments here. And if you follow the Klein et al. Correction, then you arrive at this result that a 1 standard deviation increase in ability gives you a 37% increase in exports. Alternatively, you could do a shrinkage estimator. It would give roughly comparable results. So why do I believe that appointments are indeed orthogonal to underlying export trends? 2 important reasons are related to this 3-yearly rotation of these bureaucrats. What the 3-yearly rotation means is that you cannot perfectly time when you send a specific bureaucrat to a specific destination country. If you did try, you would induce differential pretrends. So let's suppose that the UK saw greatly increasing potential for Korean exports in 1983. And because of that, you're sending a great bureaucrat there, not in 1983 because you can't, but in 1984. And if this constraint ever binds, then you would expect to see differential pretrends between those between countries that are about to get a better bureaucrat and countries that are about to get a worse bureaucrat. And what you can see in the data, if you divide these bureaucrat transitions into bottom, middle, and top tercile transitions, is that middle and top tercile transitions look parallel to bottom tercile transitions before the change between the 2 bureaucrats, and then you see kind of an accumulating effect over the next couple of years after the new bureaucrat moves in. Yeah, and so a second part that you get from this 3-yearly rotation that's a bit less common is that losing a bureaucrat is also determined 3 years ahead of time, right? By appointing you to the UK in 1984, I'm already determining that you are going to leave the UK in 1987. So if, let's say, you're appointed to the UK in 1984 at all related to any underlying trends, then I would expect that gaining your appointment has a stronger effect, a spurious one, than losing an excellent bureaucrat. And what you can see in the data is that the effect of, so when you divide up the effect of the bureaucrat-bureaucrat transition into the effect of the new bureaucrat coming in and the old bureaucrat leaving, then those look extremely symmetric. A third consideration is one that is more qualitative, and that is that it does appear plausible to me that co-trust targets are indeed likely uncorrelated with this time-varying exports, with these export trends. And that is because they may be very strategic. They may be sending good bureaucrats to statically important countries, right? The US and Japan are always by far the most important destination markets, just as an example. There's nothing that can happen to demand in Germany, the UK, etc., to make them as important as the US and Japan. And similarly, there's nothing that can happen to Greece as an export destination market that can make it similarly important as those larger European countries. Yeah, and from qualitative interviews, we also know that there are a number of other constraints in appointing those bureaucrats, what languages they speak, how desirable certain locations are. They're trying to institute some sort of fairness. You don't get sent to the UK, to the US, to Japan. There might be, you might be sent to a less attractive country from the bureaucrat perspective. Yeah, there are a number of other constraints, but let me not go into that. There are a number of additional checks that we do that I'm happy to talk about, but let me spend more time talking about the mechanism. So one result that we have is that it seems like these good bureaucrats tap into import demand. That is interesting because these offices' tasks are essentially come down to connecting import demand and export supply. So what I'm doing here, I showed you the event study with different tercile transitions, and here I'm interacting this with product-specific demand in any given country year, right? So how much demand is there? How much growth is there in France's imports of cars from countries that are not South Korea? And what you can see is that this interaction, it also looks pretty parallel before the bureaucrat comes in, and then you see a jump up in line with kind of the difference in those bureaucrat fixed effects. And the effect size here is pretty hard to interpret, so I can tell you that this comes down to an increase in the reaction to demand conditions by about 28%. And this interaction explains much of the bureaucrat effect, but not all of it. I also want to say, and this has more perhaps of a policy implication, I'm happy to talk about that it does look like ineffective bureaucrats are not reappointed. So here I'm plotting residualized exports during a bureaucrat's first appointment, and I'm doing this for bureaucrats that only ever have one appointment and for bureaucrats that have more than one appointment ever. And what you can really see, or what is really striking, is that you have this fat left tail for bureaucrats that only ever see one appointment. And yeah, you can do a regression regarding this. It's very statistically significant, but of course, I didn't know this ahead of time. So take it with a grain of salt. And I mean, potentially this is an optimal organizational response to a setting where you have high uncertainty about bureaucrat ability and you're maximizing kind of a well-defined left-hand side variable. Then it may be optimal to run some low-stakes projects to select out low performers. And again, I would love to talk more about it, but let me just give you the one-slide version of the other two results. So this is the results regarding the office openings. You can see that previous to the office opening, trends look parallel. After the opening, exports grow by around 38% if you take the effects in years 9, 10, or 11, if you average those. These office openings also don't target growing markets. I have another slide regarding that in another presentation. And these openings do seem to instead target predetermined gravity variables. So within Europe, you can think of those countries as essentially being all at the same distance to South Korea, to a first-order approximation. And what really matters is predetermined market size. So market size in 1962 really predicts when you get your office opening. The last result is regarding bureaucrat experience. Like I said, I'm looking for this quasi-random component of experience, the change in input demand during your first appointment to France. And then I see that upon your appointment or your next appointment to the UK, products that see, because of your appointment, an increase in experience, see an increase in exports by about 3%. And these experience effects are concentrated, again, in products with demand growth, if you include this interaction. And that's it. So I think I mostly managed to keep to the time. So the main conclusion is that industrial policy's effect depends on the capacity with which it's implemented, at least for certain types of policies. Another thing is that good and bad potential managers or bureaucrats do seem to exist everywhere. So it's not the case that I'm finding these Korean bureaucrats are all great. I'm finding variation around it, which may go against some priors. Putting the good ones in key positions does seem to be something that matters for economic growth, and in tasks with uncertainty, selecting out the bad bureaucrats may be key. And let me take 20 seconds for this. So what I do observe is that the first appointments are generally to countries that are less important to South Korea regarding two measures that I have in the paper. And so it does seem in line with them pursuing a strategy similar to that. Yeah, I think the experience results are interesting as well, but I think I've already talked about those. And yeah, I just want to reiterate that I hope the main contribution here is to establish a link between state capacity and industrial policy that we didn't previously have. Thank you very much.
So we're going to take a few questions, give Phillip a chance to respond, and then hopefully we'll have time for a second half. Let's
start here. Hi. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, this whole issue of capacity, bureaucratic capacity in industrial policy has many dimensions, as you know. One of the reasons that, say, the East Asian Numerical Study argued that other countries should not emulate the East Asian example is because they don't have the bureaucratic capacity. What you're saying is there are good and bad bureaucrats in almost all civil services, so there's no. Then the other argument, of course, is that of Ha-Joon Chang, which is that learning by doing in actual industrial capacity implementation. So bureaucrats learn by doing with industrial policy. And you have many examples of countries which started off being very successful and then falling off with industrial policy, and that is not to do with the bureaucratic capacity changing, but something else changes, policy changes. Okay? So, thank you.
Okay, let's go here, and then Salo, and let's try to keep these quick.
So as a bureaucrat, I love the finding that bureaucrats can impact program success. The question I had is, do you see anything built on that question in the data where how they train and organize the bureaucrat selection process over time changes? Because in 2 years, we've changed dramatically who we look for and who we hire. So I would imagine over 35 years, they start selecting a different type of person.
Can I go? Over here. Yes, so over the past 6 months, a year, coincidentally, I've been working very closely with Brazilian trade promotion agency. And don't quote me on this, but to a large extent, they are like glorified travel agents. They take Brazilian firms abroad or take foreign buyers to Brazil. So my question here, from your perspective, what does it mean to be a good chief of station for a Korean trade firm? What do they do? Or what do the good ones do? Or what is it that the bad ones don't do?
Great. So let's give Phillip.
Yeah, I have one. All right. Trying to manage a few things here at once. Okay, first of all, there are many dimensions of capacity to implement industrial policy, surely. I'm zooming in on one that you may or may not have ex ante thought is the most important one. It is one that is studyable, where I do find variation, right? So that is kind of the main reason why I'm studying it. And I do think it's important to have a result that shows that kind of this type of variation does indeed matter. Now I do have, so you did mention that there is a narrative that other countries don't have the same type of capacity as South Korea did, and that's why they shouldn't follow the same type of policies, potentially. Yeah, so I mean, my paper doesn't make any comparison about like how well South Korea is doing this versus other countries, right? I can tell you that they're not doing poorly because on average you see an effect, and then also they seem to be selecting out the bad guys. Those seem positive things. On the other hand, I mean, I have read quite a bit of qualitative work written contemporaneously about Korea in the 1960s, for example, which doesn't scream out this is a high capacity environment. So it's not. So I think it is not entirely obvious that South Korea was a high capacity environment that was going to be successful at any policy that they would have thrown at the economy at that point in time. And so perhaps that's also why I think it is perhaps somewhat surprising that you find such big differences between Korean bureaucrats compared to some narratives of the Korean bureaucracy just being super efficient overall. Yeah, bureaucrats learning by doing in implementing industrial policy. I suppose the last result does speak to that being relevant. A limitation there is that, of course, I'm looking at quasi-random variation, and then I'm finding a much smaller effect of experience than I find in terms of the differences between bureaucrats, the pre-existing differences. But of course, I'm only finding the effect of that quasi-random variation, right? I cannot tell you what would be the case if you had kind of the overall. Okay. One caveat regarding kind of the bureaucrat experience result is that I'm making within bureaucrat comparisons, right? So bureaucrats shift kind of what type of exports they are supporting towards ones that they are already familiar with, towards products that they are already familiar with. So it doesn't, it's a result that bureaucrat experience matters rather than driving everything, I suppose. So, okay, do I see how bureaucrats train and organize, or do I see how the organization trains and organizes these bureaucrats, or how they're selected over time, how that changes? So the short answer is that I don't have a ton of information about that. One thing that I do have is I have some data on which manager coincides with which subordinates in an office. That data doesn't exist for every bureaucrat for every office every year. It exists for some offices for a lot of years, and for some years for a lot of offices. But that's a bit of a limitation there. I could do some descriptives regarding that, and that's something that has been on my mind. But yeah, I don't have an answer as of right now. You could, of course, also look at some more intermediate outcomes in terms of the reports that are written or the firms that show up at the trade fairs that those guys organize. Those are all possible, and we're looking into that. It's not entirely clear what you would expect better bureaucrats to do differently from the less good ones. So, okay, glorified travel agents. So it is something that I've heard, and I think there are some. I vaguely remember some newspaper articles in South Korea also criticizing Kotra from that perspective. And one interpretation of the results is, one incredible speculation would be that the worst ones are travel agents and the better ones are not, perhaps. One thing that I think is also worth noting is that these offices are pretty large that Kotra has in other countries. So I've been to a few of their offices. They're really, in some of those, there are dozens of people, which is, I think, on a different scale than some other countries. Dozens of people, yeah. And I think that answers the questions mostly, hopefully.
Are there more questions? There, and we'll go one at a time at this point because we're pretty pressed for time. So let's be as efficient as possible.
One thing that's really interesting is that they're actually rewarding the good bureaucrats and they're actually not reappointing the bad ones, and that drives a lot of the results. What is it about a Korea that would do something like that as opposed to a World Bank where they did a similar kind of decomposition and they didn't find that they were giving more loans to the better performers?
Yeah, I think, so I don't know is the short answer, right? This is going to be speculation. But of course, one thing that's pretty nice about this type of organization is that you have a pretty clearly defined outcome variable. Now, that isn't only the case with Kotra, but I mean, Korea as a whole was targeting exports for a long time period, and that gives kind of the entire state apparatus a pretty measurable mission, perhaps, to achieve, and that makes this possible. I also want to caveat that, so I don't see that they're firing the bad performers. I see that they no longer get appointed as the country managers of one of these offices, right? So it may well be that just the organization, but it's an equilibrium outcome, right? I can't tell you whether it's the bureaucrats that realize they're not performing particularly well and they don't actually like this job, and so they're doing something else. And perhaps just one last caveat is also that I think the type of ability that makes you good at this job isn't necessarily something that makes you very good at many other jobs, right? So potentially, yeah, so that is one important caveat, I think.
We have time for one more very quick question. Is that Nikhil?
Thanks so much. I'm super interested in how if you see any like exposure effects from being exposed to good bureaucrats persisting in your data, where, you know, if you encounter a good bureaucrat, do you have a higher likelihood of becoming a good bureaucrat yourself?
Yeah, so basically that would require to see like managers and subordinates at the same time. So because that is kind of selected when I do observe it, I haven't looked into it, but yeah, it's definitely very interesting. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure like whether, I need to think about whether there's any bias that is induced by kind of which of those relationships I do and don't observe, basically.